At its peak, ESPN was in over 100 million American homes. It was the most profitable network Disney owned. It built the very idea that sports should be on television 24 hours a day. But today, Disney is fighting to protect ESPN from an $11 billion problem, one so serious that it forced the most powerful sports brand in the world to blow up its own business model and start over. This is the story of how a traffic jam in Connecticut turned into a media empire, and how that empire almost got buried by the very television system that built it. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how ESPN rose from a desperate, half-funded idea into the most dominant sports network on the planet, and exactly how the cable business that made it rich slowly turned into the thing threatening to break it. And stick around, because near the end, I'll show you one small number from ESPN's very first year, something that had almost nothing to do with sports, that ended up predicting everything that would eventually go wrong. Let's go back to August 16, 1978. Bill Rasmussen and his son Scott are sitting in traffic near Waterbury, Connecticut. And somewhere in that traffic jam, they land on an idea that, at the time, sounds almost delusional: a television network that shows sports 24 hours a day. Understand how strange this idea was in 1978. Television schedules back then were built around scarcity. Live sports appeared in small windows. A game here, a tournament there, and that was it. The idea of a channel dedicated entirely to sports, all day, every day, wasn't just ambitious. It sounded ridiculous. But the Rasmussens noticed something almost nobody else was paying attention to: satellite technology. They realized a satellite signal could distribute television across the entire country far more efficiently than traditional cable landlines ever could. That was the opening. That was the nobody else was doing this moment every great rise and fall story needs. So they did something incredibly risky. Before they even knew how they were going to fill the schedule, they signed a 5-year, $2.6 million contract for a satellite transponder. To even secure that deal, they had to come up with a $34,167 refundable deposit, real money, real risk, no guarantee of success. And then came the terrifying part. They now had to fill roughly 8,760 hours of television every single year. There was no business model for this. Nobody had ever tried to program a 24-hour all-sports channel before, because nobody thought it was possible. Their answer was radical for the time: show all sports, all day, every day. Big ones, small ones, it didn't matter. They called it the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network, ESPN. The network officially launched on September 7, 1979, at 7 p.m. Eastern, becoming the world's first all-sports, satellite-delivered cable network, based out of Bristol, Connecticut, a small town that would become permanently linked to the ESPN name. The very first thing that aired was SportsCenter, hosted by George Grande and Lee Leonard. And here's the detail that makes it feel so human. Unlike most television at the time, that first broadcast leaned heavily on ad-libbing instead of scripted teleprompters. They were figuring it out live on air. ESPN's very first live sporting event wasn't the NFL or the NBA. It was a slow-pitch softball game between the Milwaukee Schlitzes and the Kentucky Bourbons. In its first year, ESPN's schedule was a strange, sprawling mix: college football, soccer, basketball, tennis, bowling, boxing, golf, rugby, even Australian-style sporting events. And yet, within that first year, ESPN was already reaching around 4 million U.S. households. Here's the twist that makes this an origin myth worth telling: ESPN's early weakness became its biggest weapon. Big networks didn't want the niche sports. They considered them too small, too obscure, not worth the airtime. ESPN scooped up everything the giants ignored, because ESPN had airtime that needed filling whenever traditional television had nothing else to show. But make no mistake, nobody was confident this would work. Some of ESPN's own early employees thought the whole thing might collapse. One early staffer later admitted that watching the channel broadcast sailing, slow-pitch softball, and Australian rules football felt like watching a hot mess that surely wouldn't last. The production reality backed that feeling up. Some days, SportsCenter's anchors had barely 10 minutes of actual highlight footage to work with. The rest of the broadcast had to be filled with conversation, panel discussion, scores, and graphics, pure improvisation dressed up as programming. But underneath all of that chaos, something much bigger was happening. ESPN wasn't just building a channel. It was building a habit. Before ESPN, Americans expected sports during specific events, specific weekends, specific time slots. ESPN slowly rewired that expectation, training viewers to believe that sports should be available at almost any hour, any day. That shift, from sports as an event to sports as a daily category of entertainment, became the foundation of the empire ESPN would eventually build. And that foundation matters for one more reason. Understanding how ESPN changed television habits is the key to understanding the crisis we're about to walk through. ESPN didn't just sell sports. It sold a new way of watching television. And decades later, that exact same shift in how people watch television is what would come back to threaten everything they built. Once ESPN proved the format could survive, it stopped improvising and started scaling fast. In its first full year, 1980, ESPN planned 66 college football games and 130 college basketball contests. That same year, it broadcast 23 NCAA men's basketball tournament games, an early, unglamorous seed of what would eventually become the March Madness machine. Also in 1980, ESPN started televising the NFL Draft, an event nobody expected people would actually want to watch on TV. This is where ESPN's real unfair advantage becomes clear. It never depended on just the biggest, most obvious sports. It layered in hockey, boxing, tennis, soccer, bowling, even table tennis. That gave it a structural edge. When traditional networks had programming gaps, ESPN always had sports content ready to fill them. In 1983, ESPN began distributing programming internationally, planting the first seeds of a global footprint years before global streaming was even a phrase anyone used. Then, in 1984, came a pivotal ownership shift. ABC acquired ESPN from Getty. A 20% stake later moved to Nabisco, and then to Hearst. This mattered enormously because it plugged ESPN into an established broadcast media company's resources and relationships, rocket fuel for a network that had spent its early years scraping by. In January 1987, ESPN broadcast the America's Cup live from Australia. The audience response proved something the industry hadn't fully believed yet. Satellite cable television actually had real power to capture a national audience. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. In 1987, ESPN secured the NFL's first-ever cable television rights agreement, a 13-game package that included 8 regular season games. ESPN's first-ever NFL telecast aired on August 16, 1987, the Chicago Bears versus the Miami Dolphins, a preseason game. It doesn't sound historic to us. That deal taught ESPN an enormous lesson. Premium sports rights don't just attract an audience. They increase the entire value of the network carrying them. Off the back of that NFL deal, ESPN launched NFL Primetime in 1987, which would go on to become one of cable television's most successful studio shows. It transformed ESPN from a channel that simply aired games into a storytelling and highlights powerhouse. The wins kept stacking. In 1988, ESPN broadcast the Pro Bowl for the first time. In 1989, it signed a 4-year deal with Major League Baseball, set to begin in 1990. By this point, the ESPN formula was fully visible: college sports, plus professional sports, plus news, plus highlights, all fused into a single brand, because ESPN never treated its sports rights as just content. Every deal was building the brand itself. The growth engine went global. On March 31, 1989, ESPN International launched its first network in Latin America, pushing ESPN from a U.S. cable channel toward becoming a genuine global sports brand. In January 1992, ESPN launched ESPN Radio, proving the brand could extend well beyond television. By March 1993, it had launched the first-ever ESPY Awards, turning itself into a cultural institution, not just a broadcaster. This was a network that had figured out a formula nobody else had. Niche sports create loyal viewers create cable distribution creates leverage for bigger sports rights, and bigger rights create even more viewers. And once ESPN discovered that loop, it never stopped feeding it. By the early to mid-1990s, ESPN looked completely untouchable. On October 1, 1993, ESPN launched ESPN2, and it was available in roughly 10 million homes right out of the gate. This wasn't a replacement for the original network. It was an expansion, designed to bring in additional programming and reach younger, different audiences without cannibalizing what already worked. By the end of 1993, ESPN was America's largest cable network, reaching approximately 62.7 million households. At the exact same time, ESPN International's programming had spread to 90 countries, with an international household reach of more than 45 million. By 1995, ESPN was in more than 67 million U.S. homes, roughly 70% of all American television households. Think about that number. 7 out of every 10 homes with a television in the United States could turn on ESPN. And then, in 1996, Disney acquired Capital Cities/ABC, and ESPN became part of the Disney family. On paper, this looked like the ultimate validation. The biggest entertainment company in the world now owned the biggest sports network in the world. Sponsorships were pouring in. Cultural relevance was at an all-time high. Media coverage treated ESPN as an unstoppable force. This was ESPN's false peak. The moment where, if you were watching from the outside, it looked like nothing could ever slow this thing down. But here's the flaw that was quietly built into ESPN's entire empire from the very beginning. And it wasn't fatal yet. ESPN's business model was built almost entirely on one structure: cable and satellite distribution. Cable and satellite operators collected fees from customers, and in turn, they paid carriage and affiliate fees to networks like ESPN. Disney has historically reported ESPN's subscription revenue as a combination of those affiliate fees and, later, direct-to-consumer subscriptions. For decades, this system worked beautifully. It guaranteed ESPN a steady, massive, almost automatic revenue stream, because nearly every cable subscriber in America was, often without even realizing it, paying a small slice of their monthly bill toward ESPN, whether they watched sports or not. That dependency on the cable bundle wasn't a weakness in 1996. It was the entire engine. But it also meant ESPN's fortunes were permanently tied to the health of an entire distribution system it didn't fully control. This worked, but it planted the seeds of something dangerous. Now watch how that hidden flaw slowly compounds, one pressure at a time. The market shifted. Internet streaming began offering consumers an alternative to the traditional cable bundle. This trend became known as cord cutting, and it didn't just threaten ESPN's individual subscriber count. It began to challenge the economics of the entire cable ecosystem that ESPN had been built on top of. The behavior shifted. For the first time, sports fans stopped seeing a cable subscription as mandatory to watch the games they cared about. That was arguably the single most dangerous development for ESPN, because ESPN's entire identity was built on being the place you had to go for sports. Expectations shifted. Streaming services gave consumers the freedom to pick individual platforms instead of paying for dozens of bundled channels they never watched. The convenience that once made cable attractive, everything in one package, started to feel like the opposite: bloated, expensive, and unnecessary. The economics stopped balancing. ESPN found itself trapped in a brutal contradiction. Sports broadcasting rights kept getting more expensive, while the traditional cable audience paying for those rights kept shrinking. It was being squeezed from both directions at once. This is where most of the real tension in ESPN's story lies. Not one single dramatic failure, but a slow, rolling erosion of the foundation it had spent decades building. No single event broke ESPN. It was death by 1,000 small shifts in consumer behavior, stacking on top of each other year after year. And then the numbers made the crisis impossible to ignore. According to Disney's 2025 annual report, ESPN's domestic programming and production costs reached approximately $11.24 billion. Let that number sit for a second. $11.24 billion, just to produce and program ESPN's content in the US alone. That figure exposes exactly how massive ESPN's sports business really is, and why even a small percentage increase in rights costs translates into billions of dollars in additional pressure. ESPN's traditional model was built on acquiring premium live sports and distributing them to a massive television audience. That model assumed the audience would keep growing, or at least keep holding steady. But in the streaming era, Disney was staring down an entirely different question. How do you get ESPN in front of consumers without relying on the cable bundle that built the company? This was the trigger event, not a scandal, not a single bad decision, but a fundamental mismatch between a rights cost structure built for the cable era and an audience that was leaving the cable era behind. Once that mismatch became undeniable in the numbers, the old strategy could no longer hold. So what did Disney actually do? The company began moving ESPN deliberately toward direct-to-consumer streaming. ESPN Plus launched in 2018 as Disney's first real experiment in selling ESPN-branded sports content directly to consumers, without requiring a traditional cable package at all. But ESPN Plus wasn't a full replacement. A significant portion of ESPN's major live sports rights remained tied to the traditional cable networks. Disney wasn't facing a simple choice between streaming or cable. It had to manage both businesses simultaneously, keeping the old cable machine running profitably while building an entirely new digital one underneath it. And despite everything, the underlying business kept generating enormous revenue. In fiscal 2025, Disney reported ESPN-related domestic subscription revenue of approximately $4.1 billion, and ESPN's domestic advertising revenue came in at approximately $2.85 billion. Calling this a dead business would be misleading. It was still generating billions. What was actually breaking wasn't the demand for sports. It was the distribution model that delivered it. That realization led to the biggest structural move in ESPN's modern history. On August 21, 2025, ESPN launched its full direct-to-consumer service, giving fans the ability to access ESPN's major networks and services directly, without a cable subscription standing in the way. The initial price was set at $29.99 per month, with a bundle option alongside Disney Plus and Hulu. This wasn't ESPN going out of business. This was ESPN tearing down the exact distribution system it had spent nearly 50 years building, because the system itself had become the liability. Remember that number I promised you at the start? The one that had almost nothing to do with sports? Go all the way back to 1978, that $34,167 refundable deposit the Rasmussens scraped together just to secure their satellite transponder. It wasn't a sports number. It was a distribution number. ESPN's entire existence was made possible not by great athletes or great games, but by figuring out a smarter way to distribute a signal across the country than anyone else had. That's the symbolic thread running through this entire story. ESPN was born from a distribution breakthrough, satellite technology beating the old landline system. And decades later, ESPN nearly came undone by a distribution breakdown, the cable bundle losing to streaming. The same company that once won by mastering how sports content reached people had to relearn that exact lesson all over again, decades later, from scratch. The biggest lesson here is this: the thing that makes you dominant is never the sport, the product, or the content itself. It's how that content reaches people. ESPN didn't rise because sports got better. It rose because it found a smarter way to deliver sports to living rooms than anyone else had. And it nearly fell for the exact same reason, decades later, when someone else found a smarter way to deliver it than ESPN did. Distribution isn't the background of a business story. Sometimes, it is the entire story. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Disney has now rebuilt ESPN around direct-to-consumer streaming, subscriptions, and digital sports. But is that enough to protect an $11 billion sports empire in a world where consumer habits keep changing faster than any network can adapt? Can ESPN win the streaming era the same way it won the cable era? Or has the advantage already shifted somewhere else? Let me know what you think in the comments.